Good morning. Welcome to our second section of the day, doing business with Multilateral Development Bank. So just as Jim mentioned, this is really a hidden gem because I don't know about you, but I have to admit I have close to zero knowledge in terms of the opportunity. So glad we will have the opportunity to learn more today. So a little bit quick intro about the session. So the U.S. Department of Commerce International Trade Administration has a foreign commercial service officer stationed at 5 different multilateral development bank. And this bank actually, this MDB, so multilateral development banks, lend billions of dollars in developing country for projects aimed at accelerating economic growth and social development. And doing business with any of the MDB gives U.S. companies opportunity to do business in a country where the project will be implemented. So today our speaker is Janelle Wyek. She is a senior commercial officer and commercial representative to European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. She currently serves in U.S. mission to the European Union, focusing on commercial diplomacy and trade policy. And our second speaker today is Andre Kruzgar, international trade specialist. Andre, I hope I pronounced it correctly. He is an international trade specialist and global technology deputy team leader at U.S. Commercial Service based in Chicago. Janelle, Andre, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jean. And yeah, I'll just kick it off. So pleasure to be here, and I'm glad to be able to speak on this. And as we were talking about, mostly this is just so we can get the branding out. And the U.S. Commercial Service really does have that branding problem where we're under a lot of layers of bureaucracy. So we're just glad to be able to talk on it. The first thing I'm going to just go over is just the agenda for today. So basically what we discussed, Janelle and I, what we thought was best for our ITCs and our PTACs was to kind of go over first the structure of where we are, where we're located within the ITA, how to leverage those resources. Janelle's going to go into that, what it looks like throughout the process, and what's a good fit. And then finally, just pulling it all together to discuss how it looks at your local USIAC through the process kind of implementation, and then just making sure that you're actually being able to use those resources and know where to maneuver and what it looks like to maneuver those resources. So as many of you already know, this is the organizational structure of ITA, and basically what we're just focusing on are these two offices under global markets. So you know the U.S. field offices, you've worked with us, it's the Chicago office, it's the Peoria office, it's Rockford. And then within the global markets is where the U.S. field offices are. We also have the Advocacy Center, which is where our MDB liaisons are actually housed in. So many of you have probably already worked at the Advocacy Center as well, but basically this is where we actually are supporting U.S. companies that are looking for foreign tenders, foreign bids, etc., and advocating on their behalf, as the name kind of entails. So more on this is basically when we're looking to implement this at a local level, we're really working with two offices or two business units, subunits within ITA. So we're working with the U.S. field offices, and then we're also working with the Advocacy Center within ITA. And basically these two offices are able to provide a service for these companies that are looking to do business in these MDBs, but aren't necessarily aware how to do it, if they're ready. And something that we'll be doing on the lower level is making sure that they're actually ready for this type of business. So again, U.S. field offices is going to be us in Chicago and stationed all around Illinois, all around the U.S. network. And then the Advocacy Center is where we're housing these MDB liaisons who are at the big five banks, as Jean mentioned. So the Advocacy Center, the big five banks that we're looking at right now, and Janelle's going to go into this more in depth, is the World Bank and the 4 regional banks. So African Development Bank, Asian Development Bank, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and then last but not least, the Inter-American Development Bank. Janelle is actually stationed at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And then from there, the head liaison for the MDB initiative within ITA is stationed within the World Bank. But we do have commercial liaisons within all of these banks. So Janelle's going to go more into a perspective of what it looks like to work at these banks or work with these banks through our liaisons. So Janelle, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, go ahead and yeah, they're terrific. So I'm just going to take just one little half step back from Andre's presentation because I think a number of you maybe have heard of this before. Jim certainly did. Others, it's a brand new piece, and I think in some cases it's kind of the same situation as when companies maybe weren't exactly sure what a USIAC was. And in fact, the first time I heard the term USIAC, I had no idea what it meant. U.S. Export Assistance Center. So that was really helpful to me. I spent over 20 years in the private sector in the Minneapolis market doing international marketing, market expansion, and I didn't know about the U.S. Foreign Commercial Service. So little did I know, 105, 107 offices now across the U.S. and in more than 77 countries around the world. What a great secret that I wish I had known to be putting into my secret sauce for as what I could have done. So what I did instead when I found out about it, here I am. I've been a foreign commercial officer for 10 years, so with the government. And there's a lot of different ways, as you know, to look at your business strategy and when you're starting to think about international, or if you're already working internationally. And in looking at that business strategy, part of that is what's your business model? How do you make money? Who do you sell to? And how do you get your money coming in for what you sell? And one of those places is government tenders to do projects, works, consulting with a foreign government. And so this could be new, and I just want to say this right up front. If it's new, let's listen in, have some questions anytime, now, later, doesn't matter, because it really is a strategic choice that companies have to look at government tenders. And there's some differences with what we do at the multilateral development banks in our offices on behalf of U.S. companies as to what's in the Advocacy Center. The Advocacy Center is strictly foreign government tenders, and there's a whole process that if you've worked with them, you know of it. If you haven't, it's something you could learn. It maybe is fit for you if you do bid for foreign government tenders. Our work at the multilateral development banks is not linked to the Advocacy Center. You don't have to have an Advocacy Center case, if you will, working formally with the U.S. government to access our services, just like you would contact Andre in Chicago or whatever USIAC is closest to you, or if they put you in contact with one of our offices and embassies or consulates around the world. We we can be connected. We can be helpful on those cases. We have a lot we can do otherwise, similar to a USIAC or one of our offices overseas. And as Jean said when she started, we are, as the U.S. as a country, shareholders in these 5 MDBs. And so to think about it, yeah, it's about financing, of course, but it's really financing related to the development objectives, the mission of these individual banks. It's kind of, sometimes people think that the World Bank, which is kind of the famous one, it's the big one, right? They may think that some of these other banks are sort of part of them, or maybe somehow connected and run by the World Bank. In fact, they're not. All these banks were stood up separately. They have separate sets of shareholders. They have separate missions and a little bit different way of doing things. And so in some cases, it may be a fit to look at all of them, depending on what your business strategy and where you're working in the world. And in some cases, it may be that you're really focused on a region of the world that's served by only one of the banks. Could you put the next slide, please, Andre? So we started by saying, okay, multilateral development bank, or MDB. As I mentioned, the difference is, a big one is geographic coverage. But let's talk about the emphasis on public and private projects as well. So we're talking about foreign government tenders, but in fact, the MDBs all have some percentage of their portfolio that does private financing, if you will, or private project financing in the countries where they operate. We'll talk about that more in a minute. And of course, their overall development goals change. So the key to thinking about the MDBs, though, is that when a multilateral development bank finances a project, the responsibility for implementation still rests with the borrower, that foreign government or foreign municipality, or in the case of private financing. But in this particular case, you're getting the oversight and support from the multilateral development bank, which is a benefit. Next slide. Let's talk about the financing. So I think, you know, when we talk about sovereign or sub-sovereign loans for projects, that's that public tender, that's that government tender. And in the case of a couple of the banks, a real focus and some really interesting programs at that municipal level, kind of nicer for smaller US companies that maybe have a real narrow focus internationally, because those bite sizes are a little smaller than some of those really, really big development projects, or the large ones may be a fit as well. I mentioned the private sector, and this is a very active part of the banks. So in terms of if you're going to do a project overseas, you've got a local partner or you've got a local entity that you're working with, it usually requires, it's the need to work with that local company or local entity. The banks are not in business to do loans to US companies sort of uniquely. It's not unheard of, but it really, they're looking for that partnership and that working in the country of operation, in the country of the recipient country. So there are really a lot of ways that they work with the private sector. In your case, if you are looking at doing a project, if you are thinking about some expansion, this may be a fit for your company as well, depending again on that business strategy. And also, not to mention, some companies are really focused on consulting, that either front end or after the fact, helping on a technical basis. Maybe there's a really strong value proposition that you have in working with other companies or working with governments to help them move forward. Even project preparation, helping develop tenders or procurement support. So there's opportunities there as well. Next slide. Let's look at the public side here for a minute, because that's really where a lot of our efforts are in most of the banks. And this is a really simplistic flow chart of kind of how the procurement process works and where do those opportunities sit. I mentioned consulting just a second ago, and you can see that after a multilateral development bank, you know, decides to do or is working on that decision process to finance a project, there could be consultancy opportunities there. Once that financing is approved, there's again for implementation those consultancy and of course the goods and works. So whether it's project management for a large development project or selling equipment or services, that's where that comes in. And just a note on the side there, you see for non-project specific activities, and these are for the banks themselves, they also have corporate procurement that could be of interest depending on what your business does. Next slide. I want to mention that procurement framework. I mentioned that the implementation is the responsibility of the borrower with oversight from the MDBs. And some really cool things have happened with the procurement policies at the banks over the last 5, 6, 7 years. Prior to 2017, that sort of before side of the screen that you're seeing created some frustration, and you know, people, different companies weren't as excited about maybe working with the financing projects financed by the banks. Afterwards, all the banks to one extent or another have these benefits with their new procurement frameworks, and all of these things are really, really of benefit to all companies, and of course US companies as well. Next slide. So why bid on MDB funded contracts? You may already be bidding on foreign government tenders, and that's great. And if you're successful, even better. And there's ways that we can help you as a part of the US government. That's that advocacy center, and of course our offices in embassies and consulates around the world. But financing coming through a multilateral development bank, again, you've got that oversight. So these benefits are common across any MDB. A lot of reasons why looking at if it is a part of your business model to bid on government contracts, take a look at why you might have some more confidence when it's overseen by a multilateral development bank. Next slide. Let's take a look at each individual banks just a bit. So the World Bank Group, again, the largest and probably the most well-known, headquartered in Washington, D.C., it lends over 60 billion US dollars per year throughout the world. And this is, again, both those public and private projects. The bank is funding over 1,800 investment projects in 132 countries. And then on the IPF procurements, around 14 to 20 billion. So some real big numbers running there. The World Bank Group has two goals for the world to achieve by 2030. And remember, they aren't just there to do financing, they really have development objectives, and it's important to keep those in mind if you're looking at doing some projects that are funded by the banks. For the World Bank, it's end extreme poverty by decreasing the percentage of people living on less than $190 a day to no more than 3%. And the second one is to promote shared prosperity by fostering income growth for the bottom 40% for every country. Next slide, please. 188 countries own shares in the bank. As mentioned, projects are funded across the regions, the sub-regions of the World Bank, as noted here. There may be regions that you're working in, and this is a good way to sort of narrow your focus if you'd like to look at the World Bank. Total commitments today are about $241.8 billion in loans, grants, equity investments, and guarantees to partner countries and private businesses, as noted those three categories that we looked at before. Next slide. Their top sectors include the nice laundry list here, but let's really focus on energy infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, healthcare, and water management, all very key if you're working in those sectors. Next slide. Looking at the Asian Development Bank, again, it's been around for a long time, since 1966. The strategy for their 2030 goals really sets the course for the Asian Development Bank's efforts to respond effectively to the Asian Pacific region's changing needs. And they sort of focus on a 7 set of priorities, their key priorities: addressing remaining poverty and reducing inequalities, accelerating the process to gender equality, tackling climate change, building climate and disaster resilience, and enhancing environmental sustainability, making cities more livable, promoting rural development and food security, strengthening governance and institutional capacity, and fostering regional cooperation and integration. Next slide. So this just gives you a little bit of an overview of how the ADB is structured. 68 member countries, 48 active borrowing member countries. The US, Japan are the largest shareholders in this particular case. Next slide. Here are the 5 major ADB regions, and the ADB investments projected for 21 to 23 are shown here. So it's important to look at where a bank has come, but it's also even more important when you look at future opportunities to see where they're intending to go. So again, from a regional perspective, it's good to see this, but it's also good to see where they might be putting their money for from a sector perspective as well. Next slide. The projected percent of project investments, as I mentioned, that cross section is important for you to look at. Next slide. So the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development was stood up in 1991 at the end of the Cold War, specifically to rebuild Eastern and Central European countries to become market-based economies based on democracy and pluralism. What sounds different here? This is the only multilateral development bank that has a political mandate. Not that they're not concerned about poverty, water, and so on. They are very much so, but it is a very specific political mandate. Since 1991, the bank has extended its operations east towards Central Asia and south to include countries in the Middle East and Northern Africa. They have a really key emphasis on working on the private sector. EBRD invests in projects, engages in policy dialogue, and provides technical advice to governments. And the objective, again, is building those modern economies that are competitive, well-governed, green, inclusive, resilient, and integrated. Now, European is in the name, so a lot of people may think that the EBRD is an EU institution. It's not. It is shareholders from around the world. In this case, the US is the largest country shareholder at 10%. If you put all the EU countries together, the 27, they would be more than the majority. However, they don't tend to vote as a bloc. So there's a lot of really good discussion around how to do the projects related to that mission that we talked about. Next slide. The EBRD has invested more than 150 billion euros in over 6,000 projects since its inception in 1991. Here's a snapshot of the numbers from 2021. Next slide. Again, the Eastern and Central Europe, where the EBRD started, remains a very large percentage of the overall EBRD portfolio at more than 50% if you add it up. However, the less developed regions are expected to grow significantly going forward. And again, due to the EBRD mission, building market-based economies, the overall portfolio mix looks a little different at the EBRD. It's 70% approximately private financing and 30% public financing, where the other four multilateral development banks, it's roughly the opposite. The more advanced subregions are closer to 100% private financing at this point. The less advanced regions are more in that 40 to 60%, even 70% public sector if you're focused on those government tenders. Next slide, please. So here's a snapshot of the EBRD portfolio from a sector perspective. You note the Sustainable Infrastructure Group at the bottom. It was formally pulled together under this umbrella about 4 or 5 years ago, and includes a strong focus on and commitment to the use of advanced and smart technologies, which can be a real benefit to U.S. industry. Another thing that's a little bit different based on their mission is that while the industry group has various subsectors, healthcare is not a focus here. It's not that there's nothing being done, but it's not that focus that you'll see in some of the other banks. Historically, EBRD hasn't done a lot on PPPs, but they are expected to and are looking at a lot more PPPs going forward if that's a part of your business strategy. Next slide. Looking at the African Development Bank, African nations founded the African Development Bank in 1964. Again, it's been around a long time. It's headquartered in Abidjan, Cote d'Ivoire, but there are satellite offices around the region. And in fact, those regional offices over the last few years have become a little bit more focused and more decision-making at that sub-regional level, since it's such a large continent. Obviously, a lot still happens in Abidjan, but if you're looking at the continent, it's also good to get introductions into those regional offices. The African Development Group provides assistance through two main windows: the African Development Bank, which lends at market-based rates, and the African Development Fund, which provides grants and concessional financing to the poorest countries in the region. Through over 293 project approvals in the high 5 priority areas, which I'll talk about in a second, the African Development Bank approved a total of $6.94 billion in loans, equity investments, lines of credits, and guarantees, while the African Development Fund has approved $1.6 billion in concessional loans and grants most recently. Next slide. So here you can see the bank has shareholders again from around the world, including 54 countries in Africa and 27 on other continents. The top countries for the African development projects today are Nigeria, Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, and South Africa, but obviously very active around the continent. Next slide. I mentioned the high 5. Companies that are interested in doing pursuing projects financed by the African Development Bank must really familiarize themselves with the high 5. These are the high 5 priorities. This is what the focus of the bank is over the next 10, 15, 20 years. So these are just an overview here. There's a lot of information. And as a reminder, as I haven't mentioned yet, but we do have, as Andre and Jean both said, we have commercial service offices in all these banks. You don't need to find all this out on your own. Schedule a counseling session through your USIAC and let's talk about what all these details are. But here's an example where it's very clear cut and very well presented. So I wanted to make sure you had a chance to see this. Next slide. The African Development Bank operates in all these sectors, but their top sectors are, again, energy infrastructure, agriculture and food processing, industrial mechanization and modernization, transportation, healthcare, and education. Next slide. The African Development Bank public sector projects account for about 75% of the portfolio, and private sector projects make up the remaining 25%. And here's a snapshot picture of how they look at the approvals by region and look at where they're the most active. Next slide. The Inter-American Development Bank Group is a multilateral development bank established in 1959, headquartered in Washington, D.C. They lend about $2 billion per year to government projects focused in Latin America. Next slide. The Inter-American Development Bank Group is a multilateral development bank established in 1959, headquartered in Washington, D.C. They lend about $2 billion per year to government projects focused in Latin America. Next slide. This bank is organized into 3 distinct entities: the IDB, which does sovereign lending and some concessional lending depending on the country, and it accounts for about 80% of total lending. IDB Invest, formerly the Inter-American Investment Corporation, it's the private sector lending arm of the bank and accounts for about 20% of total lending. Then there's the Multilateral Investment Fund, which provides grants to support social and economic development and finances about $85 million per year. Next slide. Again, it's nice to have a snapshot of the countries involved. There's 48 member countries, but you can see there's the borrowing countries and the non-borrowing countries, very consistent across all the banks. Next slide, please. Top sectors for the IDB: energy infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, telecommunications infrastructure, and water management. This is very similar to the World Bank. Next slide. So we've had a really quick overview of all the banks, and again, there's a lot of information. There's tons of information out there. You don't have to start that information alone. There's a lot of ways to get information. Contact your USIAC, contact your, if you're working with consultancies, there's a lot of way to dig in. But those of us that are sitting in the banks are always happy to have a call. Even if it's just, I just want to chat a little more, I didn't really understand, I want to ask all the questions that are in my head, I'm not as familiar. That's what we're there for. Let us walk you through it rather than trying to jump into a website and try to find all this information. The websites are great. There's a lot of information there. Some of it is really clear, some of it not so clear. It's that targeting and connection to your business model that makes a difference. But other things that we've learned after all these years of working with companies that are targeting projects with the financed by the multilateral development banks, most successful companies have a ground game in the country or the region, at least, where the project is going to be implemented. This could be relationships with the ministries, with the municipalities. Certainly a local partner or a local presence can be critical. Understanding the language, the culture, the business mores, and all the things that are really important. Having a local partner to navigate a country and do business in a country. And it takes resources. Companies need to be able to really take time to evaluate the opportunities based against your capabilities, bandwidth, and your risk tolerance. Really, companies are most successful in markets that are already known to them. These considerations are important whether you're looking at private project financing, public tenders, whether at the sovereign or municipality level, and for consultancy projects. You need to be very, very targeted and selective with your messaging, what fits the situation and the project. And while quick wins may not be unheard of, slow and steady wins the race in this case. Companies really need to do their homework. But if you do bid and you don't win, there's debriefs at all the banks that can be offered to give you invaluable information, win or lose, for the next time. Next slide. Again, you can see that I just can't emphasize this enough. Firms who win generally have experience in the country or have an experienced local partner. They develop and maintain relationships not only with the decision makers at the ministries or the municipalities, but also with the Multilateral Development Bank offices. And in all these countries, we also have foreign commercial service at those embassies and consulates can support as well. And you have to bid. Next slide, please. On to Andre. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Janelle. And I just want to kind of understand better and just to summarize for everybody in the audience. So just to better understand how a project works at the MDB, when a procurement is listed, it's listed for a specific country where they're going to be actually implementing the project. And it's best for that company to be already experienced within that market. It's not necessarily, just for the audience, it's not necessarily you're doing business with the MDB as in like you're just selling directly to the MDB. You're actually, the MDB is providing funds for the market to where it's actually going to be implemented, correct?
Yeah, so there are corporate, if you will, sort of corporate procurement opportunities with the banks. Those are usually around legal services, tables and chairs, that sort of thing, IT infrastructure for the bank itself. But primarily the opportunities are going to be working in a specific country or a municipality in that country. And I separate the two because the project sizes are generally a little smaller in the municipalities and very targeted, and they're generally broader and larger at the sovereign level, at the country level, if you will. But yes, it's about the financing. And again, the implementation, the decision making and the implementation is that of the borrower, either the country or the municipality, but the oversight is by the MDBs. They're required to use, with rare exception, they're required to use the MDB's procurement policy and process. That's why I talked about that at the beginning. That really helps give some confidence that there's going to be that good oversight with best practices in procurement and a real focus on international competitiveness, transparency, and rule of law.
Awesome. Thanks, Janelle. So now I just want to go into, since we have kind of the background of what the banks are doing, I wanted to go into what it looks like when you're actually doing this type of work with your local USIAC. So as an international trade center through the SBDC network or as a PTAC, how are you going to come to us with your companies that you're already working with and actually get them into actually the fold of the MDBs, get them taught up on everything, or just initially, who is a company that you should be referring here? So first and foremost, this is kind of the workflow that I envisioned, and that's what we usually work with at a local USIAC level. Let's say you, as an international trade center, have a company that you think is a good fit to work with the MDBs, but you're not necessarily sure. The first thing that we want to do is just assess readiness for them. We don't necessarily want to, we're more than happy to provide more information on what working with the MDB looks like for these companies, but we want to make sure first, if we're actually going to actively try to pursue projects, that they can do it and they're not necessarily just dumping time and resources towards nothing. So the first step is obviously assessing resource or readiness. And that's something that we can do together hand in hand. It doesn't need to be done only by you at the ITC level. If you have a company that you think is a good fit, feel free to just send like a blurb about them or something to us. And we'll easily kind of have that feedback and talk to you about it before we even include the client, if you prefer to do that, or if you want to include the client, that's perfectly fine as well. And then once we're able to assess their readiness and where they really are in terms of being able to bid on projects or being able to work with MDBs, we'll cater the first counseling session towards that. So if they're not necessarily ready to work with the MDBs, we can just do more informational things, what they should be doing to getting to that step, to that process, et cetera. It's just tailored to what your client looks like and where they are. And then as we get more mature into the workflow and more mature into their ability to work with MDBs, we're going to be able to help identify opportunities for them or if they've already identified an opportunity, we can help throughout that process, just refining what they're actually doing. And last but not least, it's a continuous process, as Janelle highlighted. It's not something that just happens overnight and you just bid on something and you win. It's usually through a long-standing relationship. So this is something that, again, we can't stress enough that we hope that a company would have the time and resources to put into that effort to keep on talking to the MDBs and to keep on maintaining that relationship. So what does assessing a company's readiness really look like? You really want to focus on what their international presence looks like now and how that overlaps with the banks themselves that they're trying to work with. As Janelle said, this is probably one of the most important things. It's really hard to stand up an operation for a project with the MDB if you don't have already the groundwork or the foundation there in the country. So this is probably one of the most important things when you're looking at projects or when you're looking at which MDB to work with or which MDB your client should be working with. It should really overlap with where they are internationally and where the banks are internationally and where they're able to help. So this is a huge point. And again, if they're not there internationally yet, obviously the U.S. Commercial Service has a bunch of other services to get them to that point. But as to be on the ground running already, they would need to know where the overlap is. again, one of the key indicators for anything that we know for exporting is if they already have success in the US, there's an indicator that they're going to have success overseas. If they've already bid on government contracts before, either international or domestic, it's a good way to know whether they have the opportunity, the infrastructure to do so on a long-term bid, such as with an MDB. But again, with that overlaps with their international presence. The capabilities to handle long-term projects, again, that's something in government tenders and public procurement, but also in private procurement when you're working with MDBs. And then last but not least, are they willing to invest the time and resources? Some of the things that we see when we're working with small to medium-sized enterprises is that we're always wearing a lot of caps. They're wearing the business cap, the marketing cap, the international sales cap. So one of the things that we want to make sure is that they're still able to invest that time and resources when they're trying to work with an MDB, work with the bank. It's something that takes a long time, and based on their readiness to be able to do that depends on what we're able to kind of point them in which direction. So once we get past assessing the company's readiness, we're going to be able to actually talk to them about what it looks like to work with the MDBs. And again, this is all based on what their readiness looks like. So we're going to obviously have to tailor it based on their current situation. So let's say you have a company that is dead set on working with a certain MDB or just wants to learn more about working with a bank. That's what Janelle is there for. That's what our liaisons are for, to help with that introductory kind of landscape of the bank if they're not sure of what they're encountering. Again, just tailored to where they are situationally. The other thing is that there might be a company that looks at what Janelle's like presented today, like, oh, billions of dollars in contracts, billions of dollars in this, and like, if I just got 1% of that or 0.5% of that, I'd be set for life. That's something that it's not necessarily how it works at all. We want to make sure that their capabilities overlap with what the bank's currently procuring for. We want to make sure that there is that kind of synergy between the bank and the company. So if the company is within an industry which the bank is not investing in, obviously it's not going to be a good fit. Maybe one of the other regional banks would be, but that particular bank would not be. It's something that it's alluring to a lot of small to medium-sized enterprises when they see these kinds of bids going out, but still needs to be tailored to their capabilities. So can't stress that enough. I think that's something that we're going to keep on saying, a recurring theme, that it needs to overlap with the bank. And then, yeah, finally, I mean, the part of the initial counseling session is particularly just saying that what's the bank strategy? How does it overlap with your company? And just, it's a dialogue between the company and the commercial liaison to make sure that that strategy is highlighted and to make sure that there is overlap between the company. Something that's continuous is just identifying opportunities with the banks. So companies themselves can look on the bank's websites and see what there currently is a public procurement for. If the company has been, in a sense, shortlisted for a dialogue with the bank or has had an existing dialogue with the bank in sort of a more consulting manner, that's something that will help them as well with identifying opportunities. Things can be tailored in that sense. We also have in the US field a subscription to an international development finance data bank, so where you can just we can find those links as well. But again, I don't want, like, one of the things that we don't want to do is just send a list of public procurements or bank procurements and be like, hey, look, there's billions of dollars, choose one and just go bid on it, because that's not necessarily how it works. You want to make sure that you're doing this hand in hand with a commercial liaison as they're doing this, and just reviewing the bid package, etc. So I just wanted to show from DevEx just where the funding is going. Again, this this platform actually helps a lot with us, just because we're able to see, kind of visualize where the funding is going, but also visualize the procurements that are out there and see how it changes over time and where the funding is going. So that's something that once we are able to assess their readiness and provide those introductory consultations, this is a tool that can easily support when they're continuing to find new projects and new opportunities. And last but not least, as I said, this is a continuous process. So this is something that I can't stress enough, takes possibly years, if not, if it could take less than a year, but it takes that time and resources from the company to facilitate and maintain that relationship. The first introductory call could result in something that spurs down like an actual opportunity, but usually it's just so the bank is aware of the company themselves and knows that they're there as an opportunity. So it's something that you're continually, as a company, developing them. They're continuing developing themselves to be able to position for those bids. But it's something that, again, long term, we'll be able to set up meetings with project managers, set up meetings based on capabilities. The liaisons, once the company is actually able to bid on a project or procurement, would be able to set up those meetings, help advocate in the sense, and just be able to consolidate the strategy of the company in an advisory role. So it's more so something that continues to happen. It's a continuous process and takes a lot of time and resources, as we mentioned. So what are the best practices as a International Trade Center, as a local SBDC network center? One of the things that, again, I've highlighted earlier is that through the PTACs that we currently have right now in our networks, those companies that you're able to help with procurements in the US and have had success in the US, those companies can possibly replicate that with foreign government tenders and foreign with MDB procurement processes. So if they're able to have success in the US and if they have an international presence within where the project is occurring, that's a good kind of fit for a company to continue to consult with on these MDB procurement processes. Obviously, include us in early on. You don't necessarily, if you don't want to share your client, you don't have to share them, but we can still provide that kind of information early on for you guys to be able to consult your clients in a way that benefits everybody. It's something that, I mean, this is what we're here for. This is part of their resources that they have available to them. So it's something that we would hope that they can tap into as soon as possible, as soon as it's part of their strategy and as soon as they see it as something that's valuable to them. And as Janelle said, there's no need to be an expert in all things MDBs. That's what we're here for. If you reach out to us through the Advocacy Center, through the MDB liaisons, through your UZACs, we're able to help with that strategy and help consolidate what the companies are doing in the MDB field. So it's really, again, just a continuous process in that sense. And it's an open dialogue for us to be able to help you consult your companies, for us to directly consult the companies, et cetera. So in that regard, that's my final slide there. And I was just going to open it up to Q&A. I don't know, Gene, if you want to moderate that, or if there's any questions, if we just can drop into the chat.
I think because the group is kind of small and everybody knows each other. So if you have a question, just unmute yourself and start asking the question.
I'll jump in. Janelle, what has been your experience with the MDB in terms of their risk appetite for investing? Is it on par with commercial banks, or I assume they tend to take more risk? Or I'm talking, I guess the sovereign level is a little different because commercial banks don't do it to sovereign lending. But when they make that lending decision, I'm trying to get a sense of whether they expect always to get paid back or not.
They do expect to get paid back. Yeah. So I'm not going to pretend that I'm all kinds of experts on how the banks are structured and do their business. Like any bank, they have to look at the sovereign level risk, how much of their portfolio is in each country. So they do have that they look like any bank. They get rated like any bank. They have very high ratings because they manage their balance sheet very, very carefully. But at the same time, they are always open and actually this isn't sort of a random thing that happens and that, sort of projects come up and then they respond to projects. All of the banks work with the governments of where they operate, their borrowing countries. On 5-year strategies. They're talking to the government, EBRD, where I'm sitting here in London, you've got what the EBRD thinks needs to be accomplished to develop these countries. You've got the countries themselves with their own plans, and they talk about the directions they might want to go, areas that they might want to invest in terms of either loans or in rare cases with, different kinds of like donor funds, they would do grants. Each bank has a different way of sort of funding, but they're going to have those 5-year strategies, and those are important to look at because that's clearly not done in a vacuum. It's done with the countries. And so the countries themselves will have an idea what things EBRD, for example, might finance. In the same country, the World Bank might be active and might finance. In my case, the Asian Development Bank crosses over in some cases. In some cases, they co-finance. And so this is all sort of in the planning stages. It's really not a random thing. So as Andre mentioned, kind of knowing where you're going as a company, where your clients are going, becomes a first really good step. And then, they do have, they're really well managed banks. They have to be to keep the ratings that they have. And in some cases, the EBRD doesn't do this. They don't do concessional financing. They're a different bank, but the African Development Bank obviously does. The World Bank obviously does others. And so even in those poorest countries, what they will likely do is look at refinancing or helping. So, for example, when the pandemic started, a lot of the banks put in place really, really quickly some packaging to help companies with liquidity issues and so on, and countries with liquidity issues refinancing rather than having bad loans. Do they have bad loans like a regular commercial bank? They do, obviously. That's all in their financial reports, but they are well managed banks, and they do watch that level of risk. But I think it's because of that planning that, it's not that commercial banks don't. They have a certain amount that their portfolio has too much, let's say, XYZ country sovereign risk, and they just can't take anymore.
Mhm.
Similarly, that's going to happen. But honestly, they work their project management and their financing management very, very carefully, I think.
And then I'll do one other one because I see Sylvia and we'll probably bounce back and forth. Is there any coordination with the Trade Development Agency? Any
Are you
relationships
talking
at
about
all?
USTDA?
Yeah, USTDA.
USTDA. Yeah, so and it's bank by bank. So just this last year, USTDA signed MOUs with the African Development Bank and the Asian Development Bank. They do projects also with the World Bank, and as far as I know, they also are doing projects with the Inter-American Development Bank. You may note by its exception that I didn't mention EBRD, and
Right.
that's because when EBRD updated their procurement policies, like I said, the policies are all very similar, but they have differences. And in 2017, they put in place in their policy that anything funded through the bank has to be internationally competitive. Now, here's a great example. EBRD means internationally competitive, meaning companies from any country in the world. ADB, Asian Development Bank, on the other hand, the companies have to be from shareholder countries. So there's some differences there. So what does internationally competitive mean? It means that even in the case of donor funds, which would be the category under which USTDA funding would come under, if the bank is doing that process and putting that money out there for a project, it has to be internationally competitive. But USTDA requires that it's tendered back to the US for US companies. And so they used to do a lot with the EBRD, and now we're looking at maybe a creative way of looking at some parallel processes. But they are quite active actually with the other banks. They don't have quite that. Again, there's slight differences when you look at the banks as to how they manage their procurement process.
Thanks.
Sorry, Jim. It's getting stormy here. Can you hear me? Okay. Sorry about the camera. It's getting stormy here, and I'm playing the. I'm getting a little fuzziness here. Thank you for the presentation. It's really an eye-opening experience. I'm just curious. When one of the slides you were talking about the percentages, you were showing the percentages where the funding is going in terms of geographic locations. Is there any data about percentages where the percentage of small businesses that are getting the funding? And also my other question is the region that I'm serving, Southern Illinois. When I talk about new programs or funding, even funding available, they tend to be a little skeptical, and they always tell me, do you have stories, personal experience, testimonials? So do you have testimonials, small businesses that have had any site, any resources where I'll be able to share with clients when I talk to them about to work with banks?
Yeah,
Thank you.
and this is a really good question. So I'm really glad you asked it, because this is something that we need to really clarify with this particular sort of opportunity, if you will. The banks don't finance U.S. companies. Okay, that's not what they do. So you wouldn't go to a bank and look for financing for what you want to do as a U.S. company. The exception to that is if, as a U.S. company, you have a local partner, you're creating a project. I'm just going to pick, Kazakhstan, because it's top of mind for me right now.
Mm-hmm.
Let's just say you have a U.S. company you're working with, however small, and they have a project in Kazakhstan that needs financing. What would happen is either they would create some sort of a more formal partnership with their local partner. Maybe it's they do a consortium or a JV or LLC, or their local partner is going to go look for the financing. And the reason I say this is that all the banks have very strong SME financing programs,
Mm-hmm.
but they're developing the countries that they're in, right? So they want to develop the SMEs in their countries where they're lending. So they want to fund that Kazakhstani SME, but it's okay if they're working with an outside partner, but there's that local connection.
Yes.
And in many of the cases, the SME programs are actually done through the local financial institutions, through the local banks. So the Kazakhstani banks, and these are big parts of the portfolio for all the banks, they finance local banks and give them training and education in order to then on-lend to SMEs, to on-lend to women-owned businesses, for youth inclusion and so on. Those are some wonderful programs, but they're meant to develop the country they're in. So you're saying to yourself, well, what's the real opportunity for my small business in the United States? And here's an example. I'm going to pick on Kazakhstan again because I know they have this program. One of the programs that EBRD does, for example, and there's similar programs at the other banks, they will fund a local bank or banks and give them training on how to do trade finance. Okay, and so that's meant to be on lent to local businesses. So if there's a local business that wants to buy your company's product and they're looking for financing, working with Andre, you'll find out about the resources if you don't already know them in the United States, Exim, others. But another opportunity is to let that local buyer in Kazakhstan know to go to their bank to see if they're participating in that trade finance program, so they could potentially get a letter of credit or some other trade financing to buy that product. So it's a little arm's length. So I'm going to bring you back over then to the public side. If your companies are bidding on government projects, as Andre said, and they bid and say, I'm going to provide this product or service at X price, and they win the bid, and they produce the product and deliver it, produce the service and deliver it, and they get paid. Foreign government tenders work the same. But as Andre said, you have to really, there's a lot of work that goes into responding to government tenders. And so that would be the other way. So they're not getting directly financed by the bank. The bank is financing a government to acquire something, and they bid to see if they can sell it to that government. Helpful?
Yes, yeah, it is. But I'm still trying to kind of break that gap in terms of
Right.
how to convince
Right.
my clients and that skepticism that, you know, that working with a government, period, either American or foreign.
Yeah.
And that skepticism will grow when you talk about foreign governments. So I'm trying to kind
Yeah.
of be more effective in terms of communicating, be a more effective communicator with them.
Yeah, and to your
help
point,
them make better.
it's really about that business strategy first before it is anything about financing. Do they want to target that market? You know,
Yes.
if they're targeting private buyers now and they're looking at targeting public buyers, it's a completely different part of the strategy. So that's critical for you to counsel them on that.
And I think working with partners, you know, like Andre and our U.S. commercial partners, I think is going to be crucial
Absolutely.
in terms of making that a successful.
I totally agree. And
Yeah.
it may not be the best place to start by looking at the MDB opportunities, but contacting Andre or others and having that, you know, what is a good place to start? That's exactly what the UZX are there for. They're wonderful.
Yes. Yes.
And I would just add, if they already have existing places where they're already exporting, that's something just to look
Right.
into that would overlap with the MDB. If they have looked, since they're part of like an ITC client, they're probably already exporting or they're looking to export. Where they already are is a good place to start. So it wouldn't necessarily be let's target this MDB and go into this market just because I want to go into that market through the MDB. It'd be, let's say I'm already exporting to Mexico, which MDB is financing projects in Mexico, if they are.
Yes, I have
Absolutely.
several. I have several clients that are very, very active in Latin America. We've been pushing that area for quite some time, and so that's an area that there is a lot of potential with several of my clients.
Yeah,
So
and one of the
that's
things
an
you may
area
want to
for.
follow, one of the things you may want to follow up through Andre is I'm not obviously quite as knowledgeable in all the details of all the banks, but I do understand that the Inter-American Development Bank, which is actually, you know, obviously active in your region where you focus, they do have some fairly unique programs, small innovative programs that could be a potential fit for SMEs that are targeting that region and have reasonably innovative technology, for example. Our senior commercial liaison coming into there is Belén Gallegos. She worked there in the past, worked in
Great.
another part of commerce for a period of time and is coming back, I think, next week. We also have Barbara White, who's been working between the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank for years and is amazing. Andre could connect you. There may be some very, very niche
Wonderful.
programs just because of that bank doing things a little differently. But
Of
again,
course.
it's like Andre said, you kind of got to step back and say, what's the readiness first and have that readiness conversation. And I really urge you to do that. You don't want companies jumping in and putting resources out when they're not really ready, because that's not doing them any favors, right? But it's that strategy conversation, and then
Yes.
would this potentially fit their strategy?
I have one client participating in the Department of Commerce mission in South America as we speak.
Oh.
And another client heading to South America. So yes, I would greatly appreciate. I'll follow up with you, Andrea, about those contacts. So thank you. Thanks very much.
And I would just add kind of like a case study there, that I had a company that I worked with that actually applied to one of the grants through the IDB. That was an innovative kind of technology that they just wanted to implement into their countries of operation. They didn't win the bid, but they did see it as a way to kind of learn more about the bank's process, learn more about the grant proposal process and everything. So it was a great learning experience for them, and they all now have it as a way to kind of do and monitor for future possibilities.
Those experiences are valuable, even if they don't win. They are, as you said, learning experiences. Absolutely. Exactly. I agree. Thank you.
Janelle and Andre, thank you for your information. I think it sounds like to me it's a really hidden gem. Normally, we're just working with general export operations for small business exporters here. but can you share any kind of one copy of a flyer or a website that we can just share with kind of a potential client? Actually, right now, I just got one or two clients on top of my head. Currently, I'm not working with them, but one of the in a Crystal Lake, and they selling project to the Costa Rica is very heavily working with the municipality in that country for the water, the improvement, the management. They do have some project on design development, and also they are bring the whole materials as well to the started the improvement there. So you already showed me how to approach that, but maybe definitely I will share that company with Andre. And but from my side, maybe it would be great if I can share some information on MBDA in a flyer or some website. It'll be available. It'll be great.
Yeah, so I just dropped in the chat the website link to the MDBs, but there's also, if you go kind of towards the middle of the website, there's a flyer that says doing business with the Multilateral Development Bank guide. And that flyer right there actually pretty much houses all that information that we've already shared. And it'll be a great brief kind of for them to be able to look through that. I'll try to post that into the chat as well.
Okay, thank you. I just got that open there. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's a good kind of piece to get them going and thinking about what it's like, what it takes, and kind of the process behind it.
Okay.
I'll jump back in since I got two of the others out. One quick question, Janelle. The countries are shareholders. So the US, for example, was an original investor. Is there any, just out of curiosity, does the US have any ongoing budget allocation to support any of the MDBs?
Boy, bank by bank. I know a few years ago there was the governors for the African Development Bank had voted to increase the investment in the African development for expansion. I have to admit to you, I haven't followed where that is. That was a broader board of governors decision for the bank, not just the US. Here at the EBRD, there really hasn't been any need. But I think just recently announced is there's been an attempt to, I think it's in Congress for approval right now, but Treasury has recommended $500 million additional, sort of more on the donor funding side, to support initiatives in Ukraine here, for example. So you're going to see that kind of thing. So there's things going on right now. I don't know enough to even speak to what might have happened recently at the other three banks, but if it's of real interest, we can certainly find out.
No, it was just because it was more curiosity. I'll get back to stuff that you do know. I mean, I'll get back to things that are in your lane.
I'd also add to that, there's a new initiative that Janelle could probably talk more than me, but Build Back Better World, which is getting rebranded into something else. But that's pretty much an allocation for international development, and it's kind of going through multilateral development banks, but it's also going, it's through a whole of government approach. But that's something that is specifically allocated for international development.
Right.
So then you mentioned this, the EBRD requires that any bids are international, and other banks are requiring that they come from a shareholder country. But assuming you qualify for either one of those, is there no bias against local bids? I mean, really, really local, as in British, or for the EBRD, they really do look at the full, it's a properly competitive bid process.
It is properly competitive, and let's be honest, distance matters. You can read the Harvard Business Review on that, right, from years ago. It absolutely matters. And so proximity has probably a lot more to play. The requirements themselves must be internationally competitive. And so that part's fine. There's oversight to that. The bank doesn't approve, but the bank has the right of no objection. There is a legal difference in that. The decision is always the borrower's, but they could pull their financing if they don't make it, right? So they can stop it. In the case of thinking about it though, so proximity, let's look about Turkey does a lot in the EBRD study. Germany does a lot, they're right there. So part of it is, I think, you know, just really pursuing it as a market. The other thing we see is there's not a real, there's a perception that there's a real orientation toward the EU and EU standards and so on, which is not something that they can put in a tender that's financed by the EBRD. But when you've got EU countries who are also recipient countries, one of the things I look for example, when I do see things coming down the pipeline is there a request for a derogation or an exception to use national procurement policies? There's nothing wrong with the EU procurement directive. On the face of it, it's wide open, but you got to watch it, the fine details as to what standards they're requiring, and they just can't. They can't do it. It has to be retendered. And so, you know, that's something I look for, but also if you're bidding and you see something that doesn't, you know, somehow sort of inherently creates barriers for countries from any country, you know, any bidder can put through a complaint process, and they take those very seriously. And some tenders, just recently we had a concern actually for a US company that was in as a subcontractor, not a bidder of record, but they noted this concern. We put the concern through, and actually the borrower was required to recast their tender and push it out with a new deadline and put it out. And it was very fair when it went out again. So it does happen that happens. But here's something that to keep in mind when it's all the bank's procurement processes. It is that the requirements are still put together by the borrower. Okay, the bank isn't putting those technical requirements together. It's the borrower doing it. And so they're supposed to put requirements in place that meet the objectives for which a development bank would fund them in the first place, right? So if you think about that borrower there, what's their knowledge base on the technology? Are they going to set their requirements sort of here? Or are they going to set their requirements here? And they may get very excited by listening to US technology companies saying, boy, we'd love to get this, but then they set their requirements here just because they want to see more bidders. And then of course, the way the process works is whatever bidders can meet these requirements 100%, then they look at the financial bid, and then the low cost bidder gets it. So it's really, you know, we've talked a lot about tenders today, and I just want to make sure we talk about pre-tender. That pre-tender process. We've talked about building relationships. We've talked about having a ground game, whatever it is, or you're active in the ground, even if it's exporting. But let's talk about the pre-tender, because, you know, having that conversation with the bank project leads, we've talked about that. They won't talk to you about the project once the tender is published. They can't. They can only talk to you about the procurement process. So it's getting that pre-tender conversation, not just with the borrower who's working on the project, but get that bank's perspective too, so you can kind of plan on it and understand where those requirements might go. And it's as in any government tender, where the more you can educate the borrower, the more they can decide what they really want.
And then Andre, so so you're in the second year of this project with Global Markets, and you're the Midwest rep. We haven't been as active. Okay, this is like one of our first big things to do, I realize, and I think we envisioned a stronger role for the ITCs. I don't have the PTACs been brought in yet formally from Illinois?
So we did when Mark was the SBDC director for the program. We had like an informational session for everybody. The referral process, I mean, I feel like a lot of people are still like unsure how to really approach a client or a company in doing so. So there hasn't necessarily been them like referrals coming from PTACs or coming from ITCs, but they have been informed about us, and we did dedicate a session to kind of like training them on.
Okay, I think I'll add that we have a roundtable with all the ITCs this afternoon, just an internal, and I'll add that as a topic because all the PTACs obviously know the ITCs very well, and so we should be able to close that loop. And then finally, you've stressed this so many times, the markets are known to them, the markets are known to them. And that was really helpful because I think I was maybe more aspirational in my original work. We did a pilot with the Asia Development Bank where we just monitored their procurement announcements all the time and then pieced them with clients. That was years and years ago, probably 15 years ago. And it was it was okay. It wasn't really that successful, but we weren't first looking at markets that are known to them. And so thank you for that clarification, because I think that really helps us fine tune the companies that we would bring to Andre and then further
Yeah.
there. So.
Absolutely. And, you know, and we've all done that for years and years and years, Jim. I mean, everybody was about tenders, right? And, you know, following but the truth is it goes right back to that business strategy. Where are your markets? And then is this another opportunity to get more business in that market?
And then lastly, Andre, so then since you see, if you're Midwest, do you have visibility on what's happening in some of the other states that are in this pilot?
Yeah, yep.
And do you see other, or even, I know Richard Swanson's on the West Coast, some of the others, do you see any other SBDC programs at a state level that's really getting this done correctly or doing it right?
No, it's more so on the kind of informational and outreach like section right now. So we're really just trying to get the word out to everybody that we're here and we can assist. So it's mostly just through like informational sessions, roundtables, webinars, etc. Nothing necessarily where the SBDC network is providing the pipeline of companies.
What you might want to consider, the SIDO and the SBDCs get together once a month for a call that Pat Kerwin did organize, but now I guess it'll be Tricia Van Orden for now. And it might be worth reaching out and getting on the agenda of one of the next calls. That way, someone will be presenting to the whole of the US network of both the state international development organizations like Margo, as well as the SBDC. So just FYI. And if you need help with that, let me know, because I'm happy to help.
Yeah, I mean, I'll pitch that to the kind of MDB team over here and see. I'll definitely reach out to you about that.
TDA just recently presented and they just blew us away. It was unbelievable. The new TDA, I'm calling because they're just really SME focused and it was impressive. Anyway, I've talked enough. Thanks. This was absolutely great.
Mm-hmm.
So we still have a few more minutes. So if there is any more question, feel free to chime in. If not, then I want to thank Janelle and Andre, coming out, speaking, to us. Of course, for my personally, I think there's a lot to think through because this is brand new idea to me. I don't know. I have been here for 5 years. That's sort of my bad. But yeah, this is a great session. Thank you guys for coming out. And for all the participants, thank you guys for attending this session. And we will see you in a general session after a short break, and make sure you're tuning for our afternoon session and our very important roundtable discussion.
Thanks for inviting us.
No, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Janelle.
Thank you.
Bye.